You're watching CCN, Clarksville Community Network.
Produced by Goodwin Productions. Powered by CDE Lightband.
The term I would describe for our courthouse is majesty.
We all need to walk the streets and see the iconic buildings and feel the atmosphere of Clarksville.
Bold in design, substantial in construction, and dignified in its appearance. The historic downtown Montgomery County Courthouse. And like a phoenix that rose from the flames, our courthouse came out of the 1878 fire. That is the reason why it was built. In 1796, the first courthouse was built somewhere down near Riverside Drive, which was Front Street. Eventually, the courthouse moved up the hill, and in 1811, there was built a brick courthouse on our present-day public square. Eventually, it was dismantled, and the Clarksville Marketplace was built where it sat. In the yard of the First Baptist Church that's located on Madison Street, but to the back on the Commerce Street side, there is a stone marker that probably a lot of people have walked by and never even looked at, but it's 1811 and it says 1/2 mile from the courthouse. The marker was probably placed there because it was the outskirts of the city. You got to remember that this was a heavily forested area. People coming in the town would be glad to find something that told them that they were near the city center, the courthouse. A lot of people came into town just for the courthouse. So 1/2 mile from the courthouse, from that point in the yard of the First Baptist Church. The next courthouse was decided to be on what we call the line of buildings between Strawberry Alley today and Franklin Street. It lasted until the Great Fire. So when the Great Fire came through, people didn't shed a tear when we lost the courthouse. The big debate then, and it was all under the auspices of Judge Charles Tyler, was where to put the next courthouse. Judge Tyler became judge in a sort of sad way. He had just returned from the Civil War to find that his farm was being sold off by auction. He went back to Cumberland Law School, where he got his law degree. And then he came to Clarksville, and upon the death of Judge King, he became judge. This was Judge Tyler's baby right here. He wanted to have complete say in it, but he did allow the magistrates to vote on the location. And there were 5 or 6 locations around Clarksville that were suggested. Some of them got votes and some of them didn't, but the final say was on the plot of land now where the courthouse stands. He also was very particular about the design, and eventually he hired George Bunting out of Indianapolis, Indiana, to build our courthouse. The courthouse itself is Italianate. It's also Victorian. It has a large basement built on a stone foundation. And then it has the main floor where the offices were, and then the second floor was where the courtrooms were. If you came up that beautiful walnut staircase, to your left would be the criminal court. That was Judge Tyler's courtroom. The ceilings were quite high, as they are still today. The woodwork was beautiful, and the floor on the main floor was white and black checkered marble. So this building was built with real care, lots of attention to detail.
I never imagined that the building that I used to walk by and stare at, I would look at this great, big, beautiful Second Empire decorated building with the Statue of Justice on top of the parapet, the clock on the very top, and I would think, one of these days, I'd just like to go in and see what it looks like. I never imagined that my name and my picture would be on the wall, and I would become part of its intrinsic history. But just to be part of its DNA, to be a citizen, and also to be a public servant, and to be able to walk into that building 2 Mondays a month and do the business of this county, to me, that's the most amazing thing. I just never imagined that I would be part of its bones. I like sitting in the big chamber that used to be the civic courtroom and take care of the things that need to be done. Is all over its walls. Whichever floor you're on, wherever you walk, you actually see the history. It is an amazing building, an amazing place, and I am so lucky to be a county commissioner for this great county and this great city. And I'm lucky to be able to do it at the old historic Montgomery County Courthouse.
We're only a mile from downtown where we live, and we were awakened by the storm, and the kids went to the basement. I went out in the yard, and then pretty much, it's funny, I saw a beach ball bounced into my yard, and then eventually insulation was floating down into the yard. We ended up on the top of the hill behind the Baptist church, and there were some city officials there. Jim Durrett was there, and I broke down in tears. I just started crying. I could, because the courthouse was gone. When I saw the courthouse, it is still an emotional moment for me to see that symbol of our community wrecked. And at the time I thought, well, how will it ever get back together? And I had no idea I would be involved in it.
It looked like World War II. It was horrific. This entire area, it was as if somebody had dropped a bomb here. And it broke my heart to see that this part of the city, which is the basis, the foundation for Clarksville, was destroyed to the magnitude that it was. But there was enough of the bones of this building to bring it back to life. And so the people that wanted to see it live again won out. We brought it back to life.
And it happened, I think, in my career when, as the old expression goes, I was feeling my oats. I had command of all the faculties. We had a good staff, a nice staff at the time. The tornado kicked us into a different gear because we, not only were we looking at multiple civic buildings downtown, private buildings. Austin Peay was a wreck. People forget that. It was a wreck. 24 departments of county government were displaced. My wife lost her office the same day. Our office was gone. Jeff Bibb and Frank Lott graciously offered us a vacant building, and we were sitting in there knee to knee, working on door tops, really. After we got kind of settled and before we got back in our building, Doug Weiland called me up and he said, I want you to help us with the courthouse. And the first order of business was not to start in on the restoration, but to try to help them recover the insurance money, because the event was a large event for the insurance company, whose name I won't mention, but my grandfather used to represent them. But it kicked it up into what they call their major claims. So they brought in their top gunslinger out of New York City to try to adjust this claim. And Doug matched me up with him. I think that guy knew within 50 cents of what we'd settle for when we started it. He was a savvy cookie, and we eventually became friends. In fact, he even offered me a job at the end of this process, but he knew where we were going, and it just took us about a year to get there. The budget was established, and there was some controversy. There were some people that came to me who I respected and said, Lane, I don't think we need to try to rebuild this old courthouse. Let's have something new. And there was a challenge there, and Doug and everybody else pitched in, and we got over that hurdle pretty quickly. Don't tear it down, unless it's worth restoring,
There are very few photographs of the inside of the courthouse. It's one of those things where you think, why didn't they take more pictures? But this is one of the few pictures that exist, and this was showing one of the offices that was on the main floor. You can see by the height of the window there how tall the ceilings were. And remember, these were buildings that didn't have air conditioning, so the ceilings were built high to conduct the heat upward and away from people when they were working in the courthouse. And the lady that's on the end is my great aunt. Her name was Jeannie Farah, and she was the first female clerk and master in Montgomery County. She also was secretary at different times to Judge Cunningham, G.G. McClure, and others. I remember her well. She was a fantastic lady. This is showing Judge Cunningham's office, and you'll see Jeannie Farah over here, right next to him. But you can see that the offices were quite large, and again, the high ceilings that were in all of the rooms of the courthouse.
We salvaged the pieces of the metal work that we could, and we had it all laid out in the courthouse yard because we had to do measured drawings for all of that. But not much of the steeple was left. It was somewhere up in Kentucky. I mean, it was all over the place, or it had been scooped up in the street and taken away. To reproduce that in drawings to the extent that somebody then could build it back was a challenge, and we had to find a photograph so you didn't have the parallax distortion. How tall was it? Was it 50 feet, 60 feet, 100 feet? What the heck? You couldn't get that from a photo. And we looked and looked and looked and looked. I wish I could remember who came up with this picture, but it had been taken from the Royal York roof, which was about halfway up the steeple. So the parallax distortion was the same top to bottom. So we took that photograph and blew that sucker up, and knowing how wide the base was, we think we got it within a foot or two of what it originally was because there were no plans. The process, it was a challenge of a lifetime for me. I don't think I'll ever be presented with anything even close. You had a building at that time that was well over 120 years old. It had already been restored once, but we had these new things called building codes. and to put back a structure of that magnitude, and it had already been determined that we were going to have to meet certain building codes. And the biggest impact was meeting the Seismic Code, which 30, 40 years ago didn't even really exist. We had to gut the building completely. None of it was restorable except the outside walls, you know, the shell of the building, but the bones had to be replaced with new bones. It really looked like Berlin in 1945. I mean, it was just the brick wall standing there without roofs or floors. I mean, you just didn't have Russian tanks rolling around.
The courthouse today, as it did then, has a clock, and the clock became known as Judge Chyler's watch because everybody in town could set their watch by that clock. And there were years when the clock wasn't running and people complained about it. Eventually it was fixed. But Judge Chyler was very particular about the courthouse. Judge Chyler's office was on the main floor. The first library of Clarksville Montgomery County was actually in his office. In 1900, we had a fire in the upper floor of the courthouse that destroyed that floor. Problem with that was a lot of our records were stored up there. So if you go to Riverview Cemetery and you want to know where Uncle John is buried and they don't have a record for that, it might be because of the 1900 fire. Judge Chyler made sure that the second floor was rebuilt and rebuilt in the same design. If you will notice on the east and west facade of the courthouse, there is a statue, and this is Lady Justice holding the scales of justice. They wanted the north-south facades to be plain because they wanted more of a pronounced entrance on the west and east sides. So you will notice her up there holding up the scales. It was funny because the newspaper reporter once called her Lady Liberty instead of Lady Justice. In the 1999 tornado, of course, the tower took a big hit, and the bell broke from its supports, fell all the way down to the basement, and did not crack. So that bell, instead of being reinserted into the tower after the tornado, it is now sitting mounted on the corner of Commerce Street and 3rd Street, and you can go up to the bell and read all about who the manufacturer was. The other notable thing about the courthouse is, of course, the crowning glory up at the top, the eagle. Now, the eagle is a weather vane. In the 1999 tornado, we lost that eagle. I don't believe today we even know where it ended up. A lot of the things that were destroyed in Clarksville ended up in the farmlands of Kentucky, so maybe our eagle is up there in Kentucky, but they replaced the bird, of course, and it's up there today, and you can see it as the wind blows.
The building where justice is served, and justice stands on the top of that building. Second Empire, you never hear of that. And it has the parapet, and it has the 4 closed corners, and then it has the clock on the top. but the building was built exactly to the specs it was. Of course, the interior has been upgraded and modernized quite some. Mother Nature can destroy it, but man can rebuild it.
We instituted a new method of contracting that had not been previously used in this community, where you actually hire the contractor before you have the drawings completed, and you kind of get to home base together. Early on, after we realized we would have to gut it, that freed us up from having to adhere to the floor plan, the historic dimension of the old floor plan, which was not very efficient. So in its place, we looked at using the rotunda, which was not a previous feature of the building. A cylinder is a very strong structure, and so we used the rotunda feature not just as a design feature, but as a structural feature to take the torsional loads of wind and seismic. And people don't realize that that thing is supported. It's built along the same technical lines as a nuclear reactor because it had to be that strong to withstand those forces. The bell tower is 90 feet tall from where it sits on the roof, which is already another 60 feet in the air. So it's way the heck up there. It's taking a lot of wind load into the ground. Now the ground in our area is like Swiss cheese. Bedrock is not dependable. And in order to found this tower that was going to take all these loads, we had to go to bedrock. And the way we did that was to drill caissons. We couldn't drive piles, which is a normal way you would do what we call deep foundations, because up there pinging on steel, we'd erect the walls. So by now, the guts of the building had been taken out. We have erected a temporary steel frame to keep the walls from blowing down. It has no roof, no floors. We have to take out the entire east portico all the way out to drive a crane in there with a 150-foot stick on it. You know, you have to get the crane back out. We did the framework for the steeple on the ground, constructed it. We built a pad in the yard of the courthouse, and then it was lifted in one piece onto the top of the rotunda. The cladding, if you would, was done in 5 annular rings, 5 vertical pieces, and they came in on trucks, lift it all the way up. And that was a big lift, you know, to go all the way up and then all the way back down. And that's the way that went, and they did that in about a week.
The courthouse is one of the 2 most photographed buildings in Clarksville. The other one is the beautiful Customs House Museum. And there was a lot of design changes in the building. It was plain looking, they added ornamentation, and eventually they came up with a plan to make it a 2-story building. Well, Judge Tyler wasn't going to have that. He was not going to have any building competing with his courthouse. So again, with his influence, the plans were changed. They made the outside of the building much more ornamental. We've got the gables, the bell tower that's up there on the roof. And that satisfied Judge Tyler. He just did not want any building to compete with his courthouse. But anytime that you go downtown, especially on the weekends, you can see people photographing these 2 buildings, the courthouse and the Customs House Museum, because they're so iconic, they're so beautiful, they're so unique, and we are proud of these buildings.
It just adds ambiance to everything that we do. We did a beautiful parade in honor of women getting the vote, thanks to the state of Tennessee. And where else would we stand and form except in front of the old historic courthouse? Of course, where else could you do it at? It brought so much ambiance just to the parade itself. Of course, I was very proud to be one of those who took part in that. This building has stood the test of time, that it is a building that's on the historical register. It is a building that is on the list for people when tourists come, a building that they must see.
Some of the other things that happened with the courthouse that I'm really proud of is the grounds were much, much improved. You know, that was the first significant piece of public art in this community. That fountain, which I still think is just a masterpiece. He captured the tornado, I think, in abstract sculptural form. And we went through an interesting process with that. You know, it was a committee. People from the Austin P Art Department and citizens were on it. We had a national search. We had 30 submissions, and we narrowed it down to 3 or 4, and they built models, came in and made presentations, and I think we definitely made the right choice in the one that we have. We won a bunch of awards, and you know, that you have to do that. You have to promote yourself, and of course I'm past that now, but it won awards up to a national level. We won the highest award the state gives out, and then the contractor won of a national agency the highest award that they gave out in that year for, and should have, because of the, as I related to you, the extreme difficulty in, I mean, it was a touch and go thing for a while, because there were days when that whole thing was exposed, and another terrible windstorm, we might not have had the ability to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but we did.
If you walk the streets, you will, and just look, don't put your head down, don't look at your phone, look up, look at the beauty that surrounds you, the iconic structures that we have. They're magnificent. I think it's a structure that needs to stand, and we need to be good stewards of it because of its iconic place in the history of Clarksville, in the life of Clarksville, and for our future generations growing up. They need to know what went before them. They need to know how things were done, how things were built, and what made them last. I think that's what we need to do. We need to be good stewards of that building and all the other buildings that we have here in Clarksville that have been built and have lasted for so many years.
For current and exclusive content, subscribe to CDE Lightband, connecting you at the speed of light.